Hi guys, in today's Wisdom Wednesday, I'm going to be talking about the science in bro science. So for those of you who aren't familiar, bro science is basically a phrase that has been coined by people making memes about getting bigger or stronger. But the reality is I hear so much rubbish and absolute drivel spouted by people at the gym in terms of increasing muscle mass. And in today's video, I want to outline the scientific principles that underpin hypertrophy, or the act of increasing muscle mass, and put a few rumours and myths to bed. So what we're going to look at in this presentation. So firstly, the most important thing about training to increase muscle mass is the principles of this training. A lot of people stumble across these principles by accident. Their training works and they add muscle mass to their frame and they think it's because of a special exercise or a special routine, but they don't realize that it's actually a result of applying the key principles of hypertrophy. Now, this is also the reason why, if you look at different sports, they'll still produce a muscular physique. If you look at, for example, elite swimmers, gymnasts, powerlifters, weightlifters, crossfitters, they all apply the principles of hypertrophy, but perhaps in slightly different ways. So it's not to say that this is the one way to get bigger and ignore all other aspects, but just a pointer to the fact that you tick these principles, you're doing pretty well. We're going to talk about the importance of recovery because it's obviously a bit different if you're an athlete versus the everyday person, and equally you cannot adapt to a stimulus that you cannot recover from. That means you can train as hard as you like to increase muscle mass, but if your recovery is not on point, your muscles are not going to grow. We're also going to talk about what hypertrophy might look like for an athlete who needs to increase muscle mass or increase weight versus everyone else, and why that should even differ. And finally, we're going to talk about the best exercises. So principles of hypertrophy, number one, mechanical tension. So how much weight can you lift? I see a lot of people in the gym who are obsessing about how many reps they got with something like a bicep curl, but they can't even bench press their own body weight. The reality is, it's like, for me, I find that most people aren't actually strong enough to truly benefit or get the most out of their hypertrophy training. If you're not hitting certain standards across, say, squat, bench and deadlift, then you might want to prioritize compound lifts before you worry about accessories. Like I said, you'll get some people who focus solely on squat, bench and deadlift and will say compound lifts, you're going to use the most amount of muscles, so forget everything else. Now, I would say there's going to be two camps: people who are in that camp, compound lifters, and people who are in the accessory camp. Yeah, you just need to feel like you're crawling out of the gym, then you know you're working hard enough. But the reality is that it probably lies in a combination of the two, but depending where you're at in your training cycle will see how much of your training time you dedicate towards accessory work, i.e. stuff like your bicep curls and your isolating muscle groups, versus your compound work where you're looking at using as much muscle mass as possible. So this leads us nicely into metabolic stress. So this is the pump that most people go for when they're going to the gym. This is your high rep, low rest work where you can almost feel the muscle tearing or growing. But don't confuse soreness for progress. That's not to say it doesn't have its place. It absolutely does. But as I said, people stumble across these mechanisms almost by accident. Again, I've personally increased my own muscle mass through my powerlifting journey, and as I can say, going from not being able to squat even the bar to squatting double body weight for 10 reps, then your body, or your legs in this case, are going to have to physiologically change in order to adapt to that load. Finally, you've got overall muscle damage. There are so many factors that come into this that they're worth detailing almost one by one. But for me, the biggest one is going to be range of motion. If you want to get bigger, pop your ego to one side, squat deeper, touch your chest on the bench press, and don't be rounding your back on a deadlift. Range of motion is, for me, one of the single biggest factors when it comes to overall muscle damage, because, for example, someone who squats arse to grass versus someone who squats parallel, the person squatting arse to grass is doing twice as much work. Again, if your only concern is how big you are, then you want to pay attention to how much range of motion you're getting out of a specific movement, because by placing muscles on the biggest stretch, so that's the eccentric loading, or lengthening the muscle, that's how they're going to be growing. A quick word on intensity. There's a lot of stuff about whether you go to failure or don't. Generally speaking, as long as you have less than 3 reps in the tank for your hypertrophy training, you're probably in a good place. So anything over 5 reps where you've got 3 or less reps in the tank, you're probably doing all right. And as I said, on the subject of frequency, that's obviously interrelated with intensity. If you're training as hard as you possibly can, then that's obviously going to impact your recovery, which is then going to impact how often you can train. So it's about finding that sweet spot. So what do these principles of training actually look like? Because they're quite sciencey words, and again, it might simply sound like someone trying to make themselves sound clever. But mechanical tension, as I said, a lot of people aren't strong enough to appreciate the full benefits of hypertrophy training. So you might have a period of time where you focus predominantly on strength training, so for example doing stuff like 5 sets of 5, and you might have a little bit of accessory work in the higher rep range at the end of your session. If your rep maxes, or the amount of weight you can push for say 5 to 12 reps, is increasing, you can know that you're getting stronger. Equally, unless you're a rank beginner, then if the amount of weight you can shift in the 8 to 12 rep range is going up over time, realistically your body is going to have to adapt and put on muscle in order to support this. This means that you can be reasonably certain if that 8 to 12 rep max is going up, you are putting on muscle. Metabolic stress is simply when we're training closer to failure and is almost the burn or the pump we experience within the muscle. This means training higher rep ranges, so anywhere from 8 reps upwards, and having limited rest periods of 30 to 90 seconds. And again, overall muscle damage, these factors all interrelate, but frequency, how often are you training a muscle group? If it's the lower body, you're probably going to train it less often than the upper body. And if it's a small muscle group like the biceps, you're probably going to train those a lot more than a big muscle group like the legs. We've already covered intensity. In terms of contraction type, a slow lowering phase is what really causes muscle damage. So for example, if you're doing a Romanian deadlift, then for example, lowering as slow as you can, so 4, 3, 2, 1, that's really going to mess your hamstrings up a lot more than if you're just going like a bat out of hell and trying to shift the bar as fast as possible. Time under tension is important because it's going to increase obviously the pump in the muscle from a metabolic perspective, and mechanical tension, you can still shift a pretty decent amount of weight even with a slow-ish tempo. And as I said, range of motion, squat deeper, work on your mobility. Trust me, your body will thank you in the long run. And finally, as I said, you cannot adapt to a stimulus you cannot recover from. Very, very basic. Are you sleeping enough? Your muscle building hormones are going to be most active when you're getting a sufficient amount of sleep, and deep sleep at that. Optimize your sleep environment, get to sleep at the same time, wake up at the same time, make sure it's a dark environment, a cool environment. All of these things are going to help you sleep more, and equally when you're fast asleep you're not packing on weight because you're obviously not eating at the same time. But as I said, hormones are going to be most active when you're muscle building hormones are going to be most active when you're getting sufficient sleep. Hydration is important because if you're dehydrated, your body isn't going to prioritize putting on muscle mass. It's going to prioritize making sure that you're not going to wither away. So as well as there's obviously a big thing about protein shakes, and obviously you need sufficient protein. 2 grams per kilo of muscle mass, per kilo of body weight is typically a good starting place. But equally, if you're dehydrated, your body ain't going to worry about the protein, it's going to worry about dehydration first. And finally, calories. If you want to increase weight, you need to be eating more calories than what you need to be in surplus, which means you're eating more calories than your daily requirements, but you ultimately need to make sure that you are fueling your training appropriately. So athletes versus everyone else, why does this even matter? So I remember many years ago when I was coaching, if I saw anyone on machines, in my head I'd be like, don't you know you're not going to build the stabilizing muscles? Don't you know you're going to activate more muscles in for example, a squat versus a leg press? But the reality is, if your sole goal is increasing muscle mass, as long as you're implying the principles of metabolic stress, i.e. the pump, mechanical tension, how much weight you're lifting, and overall muscle damage, then machines aren't actually the enemy. Yes, if you want more functional exercises or activities that will help improve, or gym activities that improve your ability to perform in daily life, then by all means squat, deadlift and bench press or whatever. But if your goal is to increase muscle mass and the exercises you are selecting help you to achieve your goal, that for me is functional. As I said, the word functional has become bastardized beyond belief, and it's now seems to mean being on Bosu balls on one leg, half blindfolded. I don't really know how that's happened, but As I said, if your aim is to increase muscle mass, compound lifts, where you're using the most amount of muscle mass possible, accessories, so your bicep curls, dips, isolated movements by all means, and machines, if that's your gig, go for it. As long as you're applying the principles of hypertrophy training, good luck to you. When it comes to athletes, however, they are going to need to maintain athletic qualities, to maintain range of motion, and it helps if the exercises we're using for hypertrophy also form a base for example, building strength and power later down the line. So for example, you might be using high rep back squats as an example, because later down the line you'll front squat and then you'll do stuff like power cleans and you still need that squatting pattern involved. I also quite like Dan John's idea, which is anaconda strength, which is basically improves the ability to create internal pressure. This is particularly important for combat athletes or grappling sports, so whether it's rugby, MMA, jiu-jitsu, any sports where you've got to deal with the internal pressure of having to resist being basically bent into a different shape by somebody else. And he recommends lifts that are going to improve this internal pressure, such as snatch grip deadlifts, front squats, double kettlebell clean and press. Would highly recommend those for athletes just because they keep the metabolic tension high, because grip work and without having to put the barbell down means it's going to increase the pressure on the cardiovascular system as well as the pumps to muscles, and also will put muscle in the right places for when it comes to dealing with contact. As I said, one of my favorite quotes is by Ralph Waldo Emerson, where he says, "As to methods, there may be a million and then some, but principles, only a few." If you understand the principles of hypertrophy training, the methods and exercises you use, quite frankly, are up to you. So drum roll please for the best exercise. Ah, what a shame. So the reality is there's no such thing as a quote-unquote best exercise for hypertrophy, although there are certainly ones which are more beneficial than others. So for example, if I'm going to barbell back squat, that's going to allow me to use a greater load than if I was to dumbbell squat. Equally, metabolic stress, the combination of variables that allow the pump, typically you're going to use a limited amount of rest, 30 to 90 seconds. You might even pair exercises or even quadruple or triple them, doing them back to back, and that's going to obviously increase the amount of blood that's pumped to a specific area, which will then follow with muscle building hormones being delivered to that area. I'll go over specific methods in the following slides. And finally, which combination will allow the greatest return on investment? For me, range of motion and training muscle groups more frequently than what you think. Again, people who train legs once a week but biceps 6 times a week, there's a little bit of a confusion there. You can certainly train legs more than once a week, but I would argue that if you're training biceps 6 days a week, then arguably the intensity isn't there that needs to be. So mechanical tension, what does that look like? Something like 5 sets of 5 with 2 to 5 minutes rest. These need to be heavy, and I'd probably want about 2, maybe 3 reps in the tank. So you want plenty of rest for that because you're aiming to build your strength, and fatigue plays very minimal part in this. Metabolic stress, again, you're looking at high reps with 30 to 90 seconds rest. There's several different methods you can use to achieve this, which I'll outline in the coming slides. Although, maybe I'll outline it on this slide. So drop sets, where you work up to a certain weight and you might maximize your reps at a certain weight, have a little bit of a rest, but take a little bit of weight off and then drop the weight down, max that weight out, bit of rest, drop it down. Supersets, so pairing 2 exercises together, something like a push exercise and a pull exercise. So for example, bench press and barbell row, or overhead press and chin-ups. MyoReps is one I've personally used. I think it's great. So you pick an exercise and a load that allows you to do 15 to 20 reps. Once you've stopped 1 rep shy of failure, you will then repeat. You'll have a rest of 5 breaths, and then you will repeat 3 to 5 reps. You'll then repeat this for as long as you can hit those 3 to 5 reps until you basically fail. As many reps as possible sets are great, especially as the last of your working sets, because it allows you to work out where you're really at. And also, if you're interested in strength gains, you can also use a predicted 1RM off of these with reasonable accuracy, but just keep in mind that the further away you go from that single rep, the less accurate these are. And finally, accessory exercises lend themselves really well to all of these methods, simply because you're using a smaller muscle group typically, and you're probably isolating a specific muscle group rather than using multiple muscle groups, which you'll typically get with compound lifts. Finally, overall muscle damage. As I said, range of motion is going to be a big one, making sure your technique and your posture is as good as it can be. Slow lowering phases, also great for increasing metabolic stress, but still allowing you to lift relatively heavy. Frequency is entirely dependent on the muscle group that you are using. If you're interested, I'm happy to send Renaissance periodizations, breakdown of how many sets for each muscle group are most appropriate depending on where you're at in your training cycle. And intensity, do you need to go to failure? You can do, but I wouldn't recommend doing it all the time because the recovery cost of that becomes too great, and that then impacts your frequency, which then impacts your overall muscle damage. Now here we get to the interesting bit. So I've broken down each muscle group and I've given example exercises which hit each of the principles. So I'm going to try and get through this as quickly as I can, but feel free to email me or drop me a message with any questions. So mechanical contention, calves, you're on them all day. So realistically, you're going to need to train them very frequently and with high volume. So we're talking anything from upwards of 20 rep type sets. Hamstrings, hip hinge work is going to do a lot of damage, especially with that slow lowering that we mentioned. However, they're only going to hit certain parts of the hamstring muscle. Nothing wrong with high rep leg curls, especially if you're just an everyday person and not looking to maximize performance. But full range of motion is crucial. If we can get to a point where we are parallel to the floor and our spine is in neutral, we're doing a great job. Equally, if you want to increase range of motion, you can put your feet up on little plates in front and further stress that hamstring muscle. If you're looking to increase muscle mass within the glutes, if there's any women watching this, highly recommend Brett Contreras' book Strong Curves. He basically says that yes, you can hip thrust and glute bridge all you want, but you also need to stretch the muscle at long muscle lengths. So believe it or not, squats and deadlifts will still help with the glutes, providing you're squeezing them at the top. And you also need to train the glutes in 3 planes of motion. So you're going to train the glutes in up and down movements. So this is your squats, your RDLs. You're going to train them in side-to-side movements, so cable hip abductions, and you're also going to train them in rotation. Whilst we're on the subject of the glutes, when you see Instagram models promoting mini bands, that's great, but that's kind of like the cherry on top. They'll still be doing a lot of the heavy work, such as squats, deadlifts, hip thrusts. Quadriceps, really interesting one. Back squats probably going to give you the range of motion provided you've been taught well, and leg press is going to allow you to overload it as well. I would recommend starting on a goblet squat when your grip fails and you can no longer lift the heaviest dumbbell, then go on to the back squat. Core, again, I've put question marks here because women will need a slightly lower body fat percentage than men in order to show muscular development of the core, but the reality is it's complementary. This means that there's a big carryover effect from heavy deadlifts, heavy squats, simply because your core has to be activated or active, otherwise you would get snapped in two. But when you're looking for the best core exercise, realistically, if it's for a physique perspective, really you just need to optimize body fat and get strong. And as long as your diet's on point, the rest will take care of itself. Triceps are an interesting one because there's a lot of carryover from other pressing movements, whether it's bench press, overhead work. So you can almost develop triceps without intending to. However, that said, weighted dips, overhead press, close grip bench are all going to be useful variations. And there's certainly no issue using high rep variations of close grip chin up, diamond press ups, high rep dips, body weight work, still really useful, especially in high volumes for the triceps. Chest, again, we're looking at bench press in all its variations, nothing wrong with push-ups, and looking to combine an element of incline pressing as well. And when it comes to the back, we're looking at combining horizontal pulling, so that's any kind of lat pull down or chin up variations, along with that was vertical pulling, and then horizontal pulling where, for example, barbell rows, inverted bodyweight rows, still great if we can get the volume in. And finally, shoulders. Yes, we want overhead pressing because the shoulders obviously work, can flex and extend at the upper arm or the shoulder, but also working the shoulder in 3 planes similar to the glutes. So lateral raises, front raises, still going to be really useful as accessories. Probably want to go quite high volume, but also make sure that we're getting the bulk of our work from pressing movements. So in summary, move well first. Probably should have mentioned this earlier, but you'd be amazed how many people look at the mirror after 2 or 3 weeks of being in the gym, think they can see a change, but the reality is the improvements in strength for a beginner primarily come from improved coordination. Your brain basically builds better patterns in terms of understanding how to perform the movement first, and then a couple of months later it starts laying down the muscle. So bearing in mind it's going to take at least 8 weeks to see any proper changes in muscle, you might as well move well first. So this is where you're using goblet squat to develop that range of motion that will later help us with back squats. We're touching our chest with or touching our chest to the floor with stuff like push-ups, because that's going to form the foundation to being able to shift more weight on the bench press. And when it comes to deadlifting, we're learning how to bend at the hips without rounding our backs. Don't be afraid to get stronger across all rep ranges. Again, I use this Ronnie Coleman quote because a lot of people, they want to get stronger, they want to get bigger, but they're afraid of shifting heavy weights. The reality is, if you train heavy across the 8 to 12 rep range, so having 2, maybe 3 reps in the tank, you are going to put on muscle mass, providing you're eating sufficient calories and protein within that. And again, if you're lifting more weight for your 8 rep max, you're getting stronger as well. Finally, it's not a case of we either only do lifts that use a lot of muscle or we do accessories. We want both and, not an either or. It might be the case that at certain parts of your training you heavily prioritize stuff like squatting, overhead pressing, chin-ups and deadlifts, and you do a little bit of accessory work, and at other points you might do a lot of accessory work, so minimal isolating, so you're isolating muscle groups and that forms the bulk of your training and you just tick over with the main lifts, but you probably always want an element of both in there. Now, if you're interested in a hypertrophy program individualized to you, or you have questions following my content, then feel free to get in touch by your preferred channel. If you're able to support the content that I put out, please head over to my Patreon page and I'd be more than grateful if you are in a position to contribute. And equally, if you want personalized content, that's also your way of doing it. Get in touch via Patreon and I'd be happy to generate some content for you to answer the questions that are going to help you towards your specific goals. Thank you very much for listening, guys. Catch you in the next video.